My name is Melissa McDermott. I'm an occupational medicine physician and a clinical toxicologist at the University of Maryland in Baltimore. I'm a longtime pal of the IAFF, and I'm going to be the moderator this morning. We have two other speakers who are also very well known to the international and friends of all of yours. Rich Duffy asked me to give a little overview of sort of the approach that academics and government investigators use to sort of ferret out when there are problems and disease risks in certain occupational groups. And so my talk is going to be general, but kind of try to set you up for what these folks are going to talk about, each talking about one of the two big outcomes of interest in the fire service, which is one, heart disease, and two, cancer. So that's kind of what the game plan is. I thought it would be interesting to you all if we start with what the 10 causes of death are in general. These are data that came off the CDC website, and you hear us talking about heart disease and cancer all the time, but look, they happen to be number 1 and number 2 on the hit parade for just any population in the US. So this maybe explains what some of the difficulty is for these folks here who are the experts in trying to tease out just what might be your risk from work as opposed to your risk from what any other American might have. So, and of course that kind of issue about what specifically is work-related is the piece that we have to both address from a health and safety point of view on the one hand and from a presumptions point of view on the other. So I'm just going to say a little bit about the obvious here, that risk factors for disease development have been identified and include occupation on the job, not just in the fire service, but in a lot of occupations. And you all know and have heard repeatedly and probably have had to say in your jurisdictions when you're defending budgets and such that we know this is one of the most dangerous occupations that there is, and that there's a very significant increased risk of heart attack, and in fact the common denominator for fireground deaths is a heart attack, as opposed to what probably the lay public thinks about in terms of the risks from smoke inhalation. So it's one of our main targets from a chronic disease point of view. But we also know, and another colleague of ours, Tom Hales, who was here yesterday and I think is still here, said a long time ago, firefighters can avoid smoke, but they can limit their exposure to carcinogens by wearing breathing apparatus while they're on the fire ground. So you old guys know, when old I mean people like me that have been doing this for a very long time, 25 or 30 years, that we used to have to talk people into wearing their breathing apparatus. And so the kind of consistent use of breathing apparatus has only been consistent for like maybe 10 years, is that fair to say? Especially across departments and during overhaul and stuff like that, it's still like not so much. But the point is, one of the things we want to do this morning is not just tell you about how bad the situation is, but what we can do to reinforce protections for you all. And obviously this is a no-brainer. Of interest, in terms of another big target of interventions to protect your health is to try to prevent exposure to cancer-causing agents. We typically think about the products of combustion, but I like to remind everybody that just about every hazard class in industrial poisons, if you will, is present on the fire ground and in firefighting and EMS work. Generally, the chemical products, physical agents, biologic, and also psychosocial involving stress and the autonomic nervous system. So in terms of the sort of look back history, studies that began in the 1970s suggested that occupational disease excesses were occurring in the fire service. How did that data get pulled together? Well, early on, people looked at death certificates and what the cause of death was, written by hand a lot of times in some old records. There were studies in specific departments that were showing an increase in cancer or heart disease over time, and also epidemiologic studies that compared specific rates of certain diseases in firefighters to non-firefighter comparison groups, because the point is we're trying to show that there's an excess or a difference between you all that we could then sort of map back to the fact that the difference must be because you're firefighters. A lot of times the cops were used as comparison populations because people thought guys in public service that theoretically were kind of in shape and at one point had to have passed some type of a test to get into public safety were sort of a better comparison group for you than, say, people that had desk jobs and stuff like that. We could argue a whole nother day about whether or not those things are true, but sort of at first blush, that was reasonable. And so there are a lot of studies, especially in the past, that compared risks of certain diseases in the fire service compared to police. So these results drove the increased push for respiratory protection, even during overhaul, and also the increased emphasis now almost 12 or 15 years ago on the wellness fitness kind of push generally, and then the initiative that the International sponsored, I guess beginning about, like I said, 12 or 15 years ago. And also presumptive legislation, and I had that appear at the top because this is a huge big deal for all of us now. I'm sure you guys know, but anybody who's sort of new to this, there are some nice references from the IAFF that have listings for every state and province, and what states have what types of presumptions. The main ones are for heart disease, lung disease, some of them lump those two together, and for specific cancers. Some of them, new ones are for infectious disease outcomes as well. So I want to give you then a little overview of how we assemble a chain of evidence. It's an investigation because we're trying to prove something. So the same stuff you see like on CSI and on TV, we kind of have to go through that, except in not as wild situations as are portrayed on TV. So obviously we have to make a case for an exposure to something that could cause the outcome of interest. That's fancy for the cancer or the heart disease. That's the outcome of interest that we're studying. So obviously, a lot of the early work focused on what was happening during fire suppression and the products of combustion. Obviously, too, fire smoke is, I think, a really good candidate. We talk about candidates that are the explanation for any excesses of disease risk that we see in populations. So fire smoke was a great candidate explanation for excesses in cancer or heart disease if they were occurring. And because they're made of these complex mixtures of toxic chemicals and also particulates, more recently we've gotten very interested in particulate exposure. Combustion products of wood, coal, and diesel, as you know, are known or presumed human carcinogens, and I want us to do a little bit about IARC. How many people have ever heard of IARC? Raise your hand. The International Agency for Research on Cancer. So there's a couple smart people in the back, but they're kind of laying low. They've heard of it. So this is the group that kind of is probably the preeminent organization, agency in the world that reviews all the data on whether a substance is or is not cancer-causing. We've got some in the US EPA does it, and NIEHS, the National Toxicology Program, National Institutes for Environmental Health Science, they've got a crowd that does it too, but kind of it's a big deal if the IARC does it. IARC is part of the UN, WHO, World Health Organization apparatus, and they invite a bunch of people to come to sit around, and they have a bunch of people that are either epidemiologists like these guys or toxicologists like I am, and they go through all the published data and they vote, honest to God, thumbs up, thumbs down. Are the data good enough to say this is cancer causing? So even though the thumbs up, thumbs down sounds sort of abrupt, there's actually classes of how good the evidence is. See evidence again, like in CSI. So they actually can grade that. But that is what this group's say-so is a lot of times what cities and what the municipalities' experts that they get to defend themselves against our claims. It's what these guys say at IARC. So this is kind of something, if any of you were in charge of presumptions in your municipalities or jurisdictions, you might want to get a little smart about this. So I kind of said who they are. They're in Lyon, France, and like I said, if you're an expert, you get invited to come and deliberate about this. Typically, the way you get invited to look at the evidence with them is you've already published stuff like these guys have on the specific topic. Or you've done a lot of review articles and you know a whole bunch about it or have taught about it and this kind of thing. So theoretically, it's true experts. Historically, they've had some people with dicey backgrounds that were related a lot, sometimes to industry and stuff like that. Less of an issue for our crowd, but for like certain other working groups. But they've kind of cleaned up their act in the last 10 years or so, and so you really have to be a true subject matter expert typically to get involved. So they invite expert panels to review epidemiology, like I mentioned, and also there's animal toxicology studies, because part of the evidence, especially for cancer, is to see whether it causes a cancer in animals first. Believe it or not, for every human carcinogen, carcinogen's a fancy word for cancer-causing agent or substance or process or whatever, there isn't an example of a substance that causes cancer in humans. There isn't an example that hasn't already caused it in animals, or isn't when you discover the thing in humans, when you do apply it in animals or expose animals, they get it too. So historically, it's been really a linchpin piece of evidence that the substance or the candidate explanation for why there's an excess in a certain working group, it had to also cause cancer in animals. So that's huge. So these guys literally sit around with water bottles, like real long days, and argue about this stuff and go over it before they end up voting at the end. Right in the middle, the guy in the beard, that's Dr. Kurt Strafe. He's an occupational medicine physician an epidemiologist from Germany, and he's in charge of the group right now. He's a real good guy. So they kind of, wallow in the data for a couple of days, but they've had to have done an enormous amount of homework before they come. They each have to have prepared little background reviews so that they have to kind of bring the whole group up to speed before people vote. So let me just mention that the top rating they can give an agent, a top rating of if you're a group 1 agent, it means that there's no holds barred, slam dunk human carcinogen. And here are the ones that are known to cause cancer in humans that have been identified in the fireground. And these are all familiar to you guys. I'm just showing you. So there's real good evidence that you are exposed, just even in structural firefighting, to agents that are slam dunk human carcinogens. There's another group that's just below slam dunk. These are called the 2A agents. They're probably human carcinogens. Now, the reason that they're 2A and not 1 is not because they're probably not carcinogens, it's because the data's not quite there. Typically, the epidemiology studies are not quite good enough. It's sort of like things are leaning in that direction, but it's got to really be slam dunk to get in the first column. But nonetheless, a lot of times what these groups do, they meet in follow-up sessions too, and a lot of substances that were on the 2A list, as the data get better, as duration of exposure goes on, as certain occupational cohorts get followed up longer, a lot of times stuff that was in the list of the 2As get moved over to the 1 list. Some examples of that were 1,3-butadiene was originally a 2A, it got moved over to 1. Formaldehyde was a 2A, so they get moved to 1 because we have this huge high. It's sort of like the substances in 2A are like, from CSI language, they're like the persons of interest. They're probably players, but we don't quite have enough evidence to convict them. But as the years go on and the investigation continues, the evidence accrues and we convict them and they get put in group 1. So as you can see, there's a lot of face validity. There's a lot of biologic plausibility that the substances that are found in firefighting, in just plain old structural firefighting, not even hazmat, could qualify as explanations for a risk for certain cancers. This is a really old table that some of my colleagues and I put together like almost 20 years ago. So I was showing you, before those lists, I was showing you what we would call qualitative evidence. It's sort of, is the substance there? Yes, no. So that would be a sort of in general indictment. Here's quantitative evidence. And what we did was we just went through the literature as it existed, like I said, almost 20 years ago, and looked at some of these same substances and looked at how much had been measured in the firefighting environment in parts per million, and then we compared them to the permissible exposure limit. That's the OSHA limit of what guys or any workers, women as well, are allowed to be exposed to in an 8-hour working environment. And just to give you a sense that a couple of these are really astronomically high compared to what an OSHA PEL or permissible exposure limit would allow. So there's qualitative evidence and quantitative evidence that some of these substances were certainly present in the concentrations necessary, that they could be players as an explanation for why there might be increased cancers in the fire service. So the conclusions, however, as you know, IARC just looked at firefighting as an occupation and found that there wasn't enough evidence to say overall that the professional of firefighting was increased risk, and it upset a lot of people because I said that it's pretty complicated with what the reviews were. Nonetheless, these were some of the sort of overall comments they made. They cited the mechanisms and endorsed this list that I just showed you, that this isn't finished yet, this decision about whether firefighting does cause an increase in cancer. I happen to think it does, and have defended a number of presumptions, as you guys know, over the years about this. But what they're saying is that epidemiology evidence, it's not quite slam dunk. But they are sort of laying the foundation, we hope, as we go forward, as the data get better, and as working groups in the fire service get followed up longer. And I'm hoping, too, that as the toxicology gets a little bit stronger, because a lot of time there's an arm wrestling thing that goes on over there, and the epi people usually win over the tox people, and I'm a tox person, so I don't like that. But they're starting to allow other types of evidence to come into the argument. Historically, it was pretty much only epidemiology. And so if the power of the study wasn't good enough to prove something, you're out the door. Even though the animal evidence is there, I might be overstating just a little bit, but there's just a huge sort of preference for epidemiology over there. So all I'm saying is I kind of led you through what the toxicology sort of evidence gathering would be. And so anyway, so they endorse mechanisms for potential carcinogenicity. This is a quote: acute and chronic inflammatory respiratory effects were noted in firefighters. So of course this could be a setup for, we know inflammation is one of the sort of building blocks sometimes for cancer-causing problems, really in any organ system, but certainly possible in the lung. Firefighters are exposed to many toxic combustion products, including many known or probable and possible carcinogens. So they're sort of endorsing all this, but they still couldn't quite bring themselves to slam dunk it. They talked about intense and high-level exposures. So I just want to say a little bit about mechanisms. This is something they talk about a lot, and obviously we focus on in cancer and cancer toxicology, which is one of my big interests. We're interested in substances that actually can mess up DNA. So agents that are carcinogens, that is, we know they cause cancer, or mutagens, we know they cause mutations in the DNA. That's the kind of initial inciting event. So we're interested in substances that can do that. So even if we can't prove that there's an increased risk of cancer in you guys, if we can prove that substances, like in those lists that I showed you, cause mutations, that's still pretty good evidence that we need to be following that line of evidence to see if there is causation at the end of it. However, I want to just tip my hat to, especially because some of the colleagues that are here are going to maybe talk about non-mutational types of risk, really both in cancer-causing scenarios and also in certainly heart disease. People are talking a lot about other types of injury to the cell called reactive oxygen species. You've probably heard about that. Oxidative DNA damage, you might have heard about that. So it's kind of new ways of looking at damaging cells that can cause a couple of different fates or outcomes, including both cancer and heart disease. So free radical damage, some of you might have heard of that. So these are like real hot topics that are a little more recent than some of these other issues of damaging DNA. I want to say just a little bit about cardiovascular disease, so we're not just making this about cancer. In cardiovascular disease, obviously, we talk not only about what the environmental or the job exposures are, but what the individual health of the host or the worker or the firefighter is. This is really important, obviously, when it's being studied by guys like these, but also when it's being reviewed for presumptions, because people, like I said, want to know what's the fault of the job, what's the fault, if you will, of the health status of the person that gets the disease. So health status issues, personal behaviors, fitness, and genetics have to be looked at as well if you're going to try to fairly parse out what comes from the job risk and what might have happened to you even if you weren't a firefighter. In terms of the products of combustion, they are also a player even from a heart disease point of view, but then obviously the physical risks like heat, work strain, and stress are enormously important. I just want to tip my hat and can't not remind us all that we're talking about 3 principal routes of exposure: inhalation, dermal, and ingestion, from obviously coughing, swallowing what you cough, that sort of thing. So there's a lot of different ways that these carcinogenic agents can get into your body. Exposure duration is important when we're studying chronic disease like heart disease or cancer. We have to be really good about exposure duration and characterization. That's 5 syllables that means how much, how long, how intense, how high, those kinds of words that tell us, do you have a good story? Were you exposed enough for a sufficient duration, for a high enough amount that there's a good story, it's really a good possibility that something's work-related or not. This is the biggest thing that messes up a study. This is the biggest thing that shoots us in the foot when we're trying to make the argument that something's work-related. Not just in the fire service, but we all do this for a living, even looking at other occupations. When we're teaching this to our students, one of the things I say to them is, you know how in real estate, they say it's location, location, location are the 3 most important things about when you're purchasing real estate. Well, in occupational disease studies, it's exposure assessment, and exposure assessment. Almost always, the shortcoming of a study that doesn't quite get there is because their exposure assessment is crappy. So I'm just saying that's enormously important. And it's really hard in chronic disease studies like this, where you've got to be looking at somebody over a working lifetime or over 10 years, or you're looking back at exposures that started historically and the records are lousy. You get me, right? That's a lot. Everybody sees how that's a lot harder than if somebody breaks a leg while they're doing an extrication or something like that. That's pretty easy because they didn't have a broken leg the day they started. So I'm just saying, this is chronic disease stuff is really a pain. You're all, specifically to the fire service, we're actually typically, it's harder to do this because you're talking about exposures in uncontrolled environments. I call them non-fixed, because we can't just put a pump on, say, some kind of equipment that, say, a factory worker runs to measure how much gas or something that's being given off in a process. It's very hard to put pumps on you guys, or even to do environmental sampling, obviously. Lines of evidence used to clarify excess risk. So we've made the argument that there are substances in the fire service that could cause a cancer. How do you, after you characterize how much, how long, how high, what are the lines of evidence that are used to clarify if there is an increased risk? I mentioned this before, animal studies are very important, not just in cancer, but also in heart disease, because we share a lot of mechanisms in common with animals. It makes sense for us to see if there's biologic plausibility or consistency, especially animals that are more like us rather than less like us. But the human epidemiology studies are pretty much the gold standard. They're considered in terms of ranking the quality of evidence. That's the kind of stuff these guys do for a living. And also, though, making this biologic argument, the biologic plausibility, makes sense biologically that the explanations that we've lined up, that is, exposed to substances that we know can cause cancer, in fact, do it in animals, and there are these excesses that are observed in certain epidemiology studies. Does it sort of line up? Is the evidence lining up? So the question then becomes, does it make sense that we could say any excesses in the fire service might indeed be due to firefighting, as opposed to all those other possible explanations that we talked about before? We also look to see if the disease rates in other occupations that are similarly exposed to you all are consistent. For example, when I'm doing presumptive testimony, one of the things that I always like to remind everybody is, well, you know, maybe the evidence is not as slam dunk as you'd like to see it in firefighting, but if we're making the argument, let's say, that products of combustion are the explanation for some of these risks, let's say talking cancer, because that's what I usually have to do. I say, what about other workers that are exposed to the same kinds of products of combustion? Have we seen the same kinds of excesses? So I try to make the argument that there's this really whole sort of mosaic of consistency, or a tapestry that I'm trying to sew for these guys, that I'm trying to convince, that workers that share the same exposures as you all have similar excesses, and maybe they even have they're better studied, or they're less crazy to characterize because they work in more fixed environments. They're not rushing into a burning building. The pumps won't get melted if they go in and, you know, are trying to be studied or measured by people like us. So I make that argument, and a lot of people get that. A lot of lay people get that, even people that are on boards that have to make decisions. So that's, I think, a very powerful approach. So then we look for patterns that are observed. Like I said, does the type of excess make biologic sense? The excess of disease I'm talking about here in terms of agents of exposure, dose and duration. This goes to the exposure assessment that I mentioned. And latency, this is a killer, because a lot of times chronic diseases, it takes longer for them to develop than an acute problem like a broken leg, or like an infectious disease, where some guy might actually get an infectious disease, or we knew that some of the guys in Toronto got SARS because they were transporting guys in the ambulance that had SARS. So, and it happened very quickly, right, within 2 weeks or something. So that's less questionable. But for these long latency diseases, like chronic diseases that maybe take years to develop, it's really hard to kind of map a certain person's exposure to that disease. So this is really hard. Can you see why a lot of people don't like doing it? But these guys love it. God bless them. So, yeah, some days they do. Patterns of organ site excess. Like I said, there are some hints sometimes that we know that certain substances are more likely to target certain organ systems, and so that kind of ups our endorsement of the data that we're seeing. It ups our belief in what we're observing, so that kind of helps us also. And like I keep saying, is it consistent with what's seen in animals? Is it consistent in what's seen in other working populations, like, say, petrochemically exposed workers, that sort of thing, because they're similarly exposed as you guys are. So that's kind of how I would line up sort of my defense of a presumption when I do it. So epi-studies attempt to measure disease occurrence in a population in comparison to another population. I mentioned, like, historically we've compared them to the police. Why research studies clarify excess risk while that's going on, and I've told you this woe is me story about how tough it is. What do we do in the meantime? And I just want to put in a pitch for SCBA use. People are still opting out of that sometimes when it's inconvenient. It's really important. It's very important. I would also say participate in wellness fitness generally, even if you don't have the initiative in your fire department. This really is, I mean, you guys really need to be supermen and superwomen. And I'm a complete believer in the wellness fitness approach, because you really are put in harm's way, and there are some ways to protect yourself. And it's not just donning PPE. There is some stuff that you have to bring to the table before we do the best we can to protect you. So in terms of the WFI participation, Rich Duffy's also asked me to remind you all that the benefits of participation in terms of being able to share data are beyond the benefits that the individual firefighter or a fire service member gets just from getting the immediate feedback about your own health status, that we can tell about unrecognized health problems in groups of you all, monitoring status of recognized chronic conditions like heart disease, like certain cancers that we're on the lookout for. And it provides opportunity for personalized feedback and coaching. This is one of the biggest things we do when I do surveillance exams. Is this might seem like taking care of, it's sort of like a well baby visit for healthy guys and gals like you, but it's a chance for me to talk to the worker, the patient, and say, let me show you what this PFT shows, and look at this from last time, and do you see this little dip here? And so, you know, you actually get a little bit of tailored advice. So I think it's worth it. And it contributes overall to the fire service database, where we're trying to detect trends in populations of you all early. So I'm a professor of preventive medicine also, so I can't stop without saying this. So with that, I'd like to set up the next speaker. Have you guys decided, does one want to go first, rather? Does it make sense? Who wants to go first?
You want me to go first? Sure. Talk about cancer now. Oh, absolutely. All right.
Okay. So this is our colleague, Dr. Travis Kabale. He is an epidemiologist, a cancer epidemiologist from NIOSH. NIOSH, you know, is the National Institutes for Occupational Safety and Health, a longtime friend of the IAFF. So, Dr. Kabale, thanks.
Thank you.
It's on the, it's already up there. You just have to click on it. It's new. This is the new version. It's down.
Oh, down here. Where is it? Well, thanks, Melissa, and good morning. I'm, as she said, Travis Kabale, and I'm from the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health. I'm sorry, I don't get out of the basement much. I am the epidemiologist that's, you know, trying to figure out how we conduct these studies. So it's a real honor for me to be not only out of the basement, but certainly here at Redmond and hearing all of the incredible types of research that is going on in the fire service. What I'm going to talk briefly about today is probably the largest study in the last 25 to 30 years that NIOSH has conducted or is in the process of conducting. And I want to make sure that you understand that we're in the process. I'm not here this morning. I don't have any findings, but it's just to let you know, those of you that I haven't talked to about the study, what this initiative is about, and hopefully this time next year or a little later we'll have our first preliminary results. As Melissa said, one of the things that in the last, it was probably 3 years ago, the division director came to see me in the basement and said that the fire service was concerned about creating or wanting to create a large database, a database that would allow them to look at and determine if specifically cancer, they were looking at other outcomes as well, but they were mainly concerned with cancer. Are cancer rates higher in firefighters compared to the general population and also compared to other firefighters? And how would we put together a proposal, a study design that would enable the fire service to get at that, to have that database, and also to have that database going forward into the future. So what I did was that we put a team together and we came back with, you know, an answer about what it would take. And I think Melissa has touched on some of the complexities and the difficulties. And we basically said that, sure, we could do that. It would take probably a minimum of 18,000 firefighters to look at rare cancers. It would probably take an observation period of about 60 years. You would have to reconstruct, recreate for all 18,000 people, all of their work history, promotions, what they were doing during their work as a firefighter. It would probably take somewhere between 10 and 12 years, and it would cost probably between $3.5 million and $6 million to do. And I thought probably with that I would be finished and on to the next project. About 4 weeks later, the director came back and said, okay, we want you to get started on this, but there is a couple of caveats. Instead of 12 years, 10 to 12 years, you have a window of 4 years, and instead of $3.5 million to $6 million, we can give you a little less than $1 million over the 4-year period. So go forth and produce the product. And to which I said, I'm delighted, glad to take that on. So this is what we're going to talk about, just our progress. We are a year and a half into the project. And again, it's to look at and examine for the fire service, or at least create a database that will allow us going from this point into the future, looking at the risk patterns, particularly cancer among firefighters. One of the things that we are going to, and IARC has commented on this, that we have to include and that we are going to include, will be the current generation of firefighters. A lot of the previous studies really end, as Melissa alluded to, in the early 1980s, so we don't know a tremendous amount about the risk overall for firefighters after that period or for this current generation. There is also relatively sparse information for non-white firefighters and females. Again, and Melissa in her talk alluded to some of these things. I won't belabor the fact, but the fire service, I think, came to NIOSH and talked to NIOSH because there was some concern about generally the inconsistency of the research, the occupational observational studies to this point in time. Some studies, when comparing risk for firefighters to the general population, report high increases for certain outcomes, but not for others. And finding a consistent pattern has been difficult. They're also, in a period between about 2006 and 2009, in addition to the IARC's report, there was a very nice meta-analysis by researchers at the University of Cincinnati that looked at 21 different causes of death. IARC looked at 42 studies. I think the University of Cincinnati looked at 36 or 7. And there were some similarities that they thought there were probable when they estimated that there were probable cancers to be concerned about. Prostate was one. Testicular cancer was mentioned in one study, but not the other. Non-Hodgkin's lymphoma was possible, and that was mentioned in both reports. And they listed then also a group of probable or possible cancers that the fire service was concerned about. And those included things like leukemia, brain cancer, skin cancer, and several others. And so the fire service was interested in having a cohort, having a database of firefighters that would enable us to look at some of those, particularly those possible cancers. One of the things that sort of added fuel to the debate was the 2009 National League of Cities report, which was rather inflammatory, but did at least mention the need for additional longitudinal studies. And so I think that these things were sort of all coming together in and around that time that prompted the discussions with the fire service and NIOSH about putting this database together. NIOSH, as I said, one of the parameters that we had was that budgets being what they are in the fire service was that this had to be funded totally by NIOSH. So all of the data collection, all of the analysis, all of the work is funded by NIOSH. We have received some supplemental funding from the United States Fire Administration to conduct the study. Of course, the IAFF has been tremendous support for the study. Rich Duffy and his staff, as well as the local IAFF groups that I'll mention a bit later. The I Chiefs have been supportive, and also Mike DeBron's group, the Firefighter Cancer Support Network. We also have been working with the National Cancer Institute, who to date has conducted the largest cohort study in the United States of firefighters, that being the Philadelphia cohort, which is a part of our study population. IARC, I won't belabor what Melissa had talked about, just that one of the issues was the possible rating or classification, which was of concern to the fire service. And NIOSH has also received some communication from Congress about a brain cancer cluster in Anne Arundel County, Maryland, and so they were interested in what we could add to the risk as far as brain cancer is concerned. Who's participating in the study? As I said, it's underway. We are in our starting about a year and a half through our 4-year cycle. These are all firefighters, male, female, current and retired, that were employed from 1950 through 2010. And we're currently working with the Chicago, San Francisco, and Philadelphia fire departments. And I want to certainly thank in those departments Tom Ryan from Local 2 in Chicago, Tom O'Connor from Local 798 in San Francisco, and Billy Galt from Local 22 in Philadelphia, who have been magnificent supports for us, as has the command staff at all of those departments. How we're conducting the study is that we, as Melissa had talked about, we have to literally identify every single firefighter who is employed in those departments from 1950 to present. And we use, it's a records-based study, so what that means is that we go back and we look at payroll records, we look at personnel records, anything from the department that we can find that will identify firefighters that were working and how long they were working and what they were doing during their career in the department. Again, for each firefighter, we have to have, for exposure surrogate measures, we have to identify their job, how long they held it, and then with this information, we determine using state and federal cancer registries, we determine causes of death, and we determine cancer diagnosis, because we are conducting mortality analyses as well as incidence. We also are in the process of collecting modifying information. We're trying to, so that we can rank or categorize firefighters who were potentially less exposed and compare them to firefighters who were potentially more exposed. We're looking at the number of fire runs that a firefighter has been involved with, potentially over a career as well. Some of the key features, we had to have a study that was large enough to provide statistically reliable data. And for some of these cancers that are relatively rare, we estimated that we needed a minimum of 18,000. We have collected so far and have in the cohort about 30,000, so we feel very good about being able to meet that specific criteria. Again, because some of the cancers that we're talking about, it's better to identify them using incidence rather than mortality. Testicular is an example of that. We're conducting a mortality analysis, and we'll also be including incident or diagnosed cases. The exposure information we're talking about is, again, surrogate information. We're not taking direct measurements or those types of things, but we're trying to come up with a way to classify firefighters that were potentially more exposed and compare them to firefighters that over a working lifetime were potentially less exposed. And we also hope and think that this will enable us to build, the fire service wanted a framework that we could update very economically, we could add departments economically, and we could do different types of designs. So for instance, if you wanted to look more closely at a specific type of cancer in the future, like bladder cancer or testicular cancer, we would have the platform and have the information because we built the cohort and we have the data available that could be done. The accomplishments to date, we have 3 departments, as I've said, that are included in the study. And we talked to probably 10 different departments, and there is a very involved process that we go through where the protocol, which has to be approved by IRBs, both at the CDC, and since we use state registries, it has to be done in each state that we use those registries. The fire department and the fire department staff, the union, the command staff, have to vet all of the information. It's voluntary. They have to know what kinds of information we're collecting, how we're going to collect it, how we're going to use it, and that sort of thing, and how we're going to protect the data. To date, we've completed the collection for essentially all 30,000 firefighters. So we've identified who's working, and we have collected all of their work history information. And we are in the process of entering that into a database. And we have entered to date about 780 lines of information, 80,000 lines of information into the database. And we'll probably, when it's all said and done, have about 1 million to 1.5 million lines of information in the database. We also have completed the interagency agreement, which we've been very happy about for the 2nd year in a row with the United States Fire Administration for some additional funding to help us, particularly with the large amount of data coding that we have to do. The next steps include in 2011, we have done this. We have completed the cause of death determination, or hope to by the end of the year for all 3 sites. In 12, we'll complete the work history data entry, and late in 12, we'll have the first analysis, we hope, finished, which is the mortality analysis, where we'll be comparing at least firefighters in this population with the general population to see if the rates are different, and if so, for which specific causes of death. In 2013, we will be working on and will complete and report on the cancer incidence portion of the study. Again, contact information if you want to hear more about the study or what we're doing. We are in the process of talking to some additional departments to add them to the cancer incidence piece, but certainly you can talk with me or Tom Hales, who is a co-investigator with me on the study, or Bill Troop at the United States Fire Administration. And my staff wanted me to put in that we always allow time for questions. Maybe next year we'll actually have some answers. So I appreciate your patience. Thank you.
I think we're going to save questions to the end, but I promise we'll have time for that. Our last speaker is Dr. Stefano Scales, who's also a longtime friend of the International, and we're switching gears just a little bit. He's not going to talk about cancer, but about heart disease, which is the other huge big target of concern that we have in terms of chronic disease excess risk in the fire service. But he might actually talk about some mechanisms, because believe it or not, there are some shared mechanisms between heart disease risk and cancer, which is, for me, as somebody who does toxicology, I'm always trying to understand what the pathway is. So I think that's kind of interesting and exciting. So, Stefanos.
Thanks very much, Melissa. Good morning. So as Dr. McDermott said, I'm going to talk to you this morning about heart disease in the fire service. As she alluded to a little bit in her talk, this has been a hot topic for a long time, and I believe the first heart presumption law was actually passed in Pennsylvania based upon the work of your union back in about 1930. And you can see from this slide, even almost 60 years ago, physicians, this is a journal that is the Diseases of the Chest. That's a precursor of a journal that continues today. It's just called Chest Now. And it's a journal about heart disease and lung disease, basically diseases of the chest. And Dr. Reich here, who happened to be from New York City, was writing about firefighters and heart disease. And he didn't use all the methodologies that Dr. McDermott talked about, but basically based on his clinical experience, he started talking about a lot of the things that we're still talking about today, extremes of temperature, exposure to stressors, both physical and psychological, smokes and gases, et cetera. Also, as alluded to earlier, this really is about an interaction. It's not a simple not related to work and only related to lifestyle, or just related to work and not related to something else. In every single one of these cases, this is a chronic disease, which then ends up with acute events oftentimes. So it's a chronic disease, atherosclerosis, hypertension, other changes like that, developing over years, progressing, producing damage below the clinical level in the body, and then oftentimes ending, or at least being punctuated by specific events such as heart attacks, sudden cardiac death, et cetera. So it is an interaction. We've learned a lot in the last 20 years about this. These events are not random in time. They have specific relationships in time. That is, both relationships, they're more likely in certain types of duty as opposed to other types of duty. They're more likely during certain times of the day than other times of the day. They're even more likely at certain times of the year than other times of the year. It's also not like lightning striking and just bad luck. It is an unfortunate event anytime any individual's affected by heart disease, but heart disease does not strike at random. We can reliably predict who the victims are going to be based upon an excess of risk factors. And therefore, a lot of these could actually be prevented, which I think is the really most important part here. Statistics that you're probably aware of, although we've had a decrease in deaths since the 1970s in the fire service in terms of line of duty deaths, in the last 20 years, the deaths per year still remain about 90 to 100 deaths per year, with about 35 to 45 being due to heart disease. And that proportion due to heart disease has remained really rock stable, just minor fluctuations up and down. So staying at around 45%, or almost half of all events. This is not a rate, it's a proportion, because a rate involves time. But that proportion of deaths is much higher than you see in any other occupation. Police are, estimated to be as high as 22%. I don't think that that's really true, that 22% of police deaths are heart deaths, but even if you take that, it's still half the proportion that we see in firefighters. And firefighters have about 3 to 4 times the proportion of heart disease deaths among line of duty deaths as people, if you take all occupations considered. Of course, it's not all about fatalities. There's certainly a lot of heart disease retirements. There are non-fatal events that take people out of service. For every fatal event, there are many more non-fatal events. And if you look at large departments, a lot of them are having 1 or 2 cases of chest pain admission to the hospital every month. If we look at certain major cities, depending upon the state they're in and the heart presumption and other types of legislation that are involved, we can see as many as 6 to 10% of a department putting in claims for hypertension or heart disease in any given year. So that's a lot of people. Now, what about the question, does firefighting itself cause heart disease, this chronic disease? So both of my colleagues talked about epidemiologic studies, following people over time. And, although we have a lot of reasons to believe that that's true, there are difficulties in doing the study because of the healthy worker effect. That means firefighters are healthier because they're selected. They go through medical tests and physical abilities tests to get on the force. So they tend to be healthier than the general population. But overall, the data just does not show an increased risk in terms of lifetime risk of heart disease. In fact, firefighters come out about 10% lower, and that's probably due to this healthy worker effect. Nonetheless, we and others, we really believe it can't just be chance that we have all these firefighters, half of the line of duty deaths being due to heart disease. There must be a way we can study this and scientifically link the jobs and the duties that firefighters perform with specific heart disease events that occur at work. So if we think about this conceptually, we take the example of coronary heart disease, which develops from atherosclerosis, this underlying disease. Starts very early in life. We know from Vietnam, when young individuals, 18, 19 years old, were killed traumatically by explosives, gunshots, et cetera. They had autopsies. The pathologists were able to see fatty streaks in their aortas and things like that. That is basically, the onset, even at an early age. And we see this now even in teenagers in our society today. So this is a lifelong process, but it takes a long time before you actually have a bad event at the end. Now, like I said, there are a lot of reasons here that we conjecture, and we have a lot of biological plausibility or good scientific reasons why firefighting could contribute to heart disease. But the bottom line is, what we have shown, and I'll explain to you in a minute, is that firefighting, strenuous duties of firefighting can trigger a heart disease event in a person with known heart disease. That's a person who already has a diagnosis, so that's the firefighter who already had the stent 2 years ago or the cabbage 5 years ago. Or someone who didn't know they had heart disease, but it's there. They didn't have a stress test, or it wasn't picked up by the stress test. And then there's another phenomenon I'll talk about, which is very important, LVH, that's left ventricular hypertrophy. That's an enlargement of the heart, particularly in the left side, the left muscle, which is pumping the blood to your brain and the other vital organs. And this makes people more prone to arrhythmias, more prone to, it's harder to supply their heart with oxygen, and I'll illustrate that for you. But I think it's very important for you to understand what triggering is. This is something we see in heart disease epidemiology with things like air pollution, influenza, exercise, and strong emotions, anger, et cetera. Let me illustrate it for you here. This is a study done in Germany. They compared cardiovascular events in 2006. That's the year that the World Cup was hosted by Germany. And you can see we have different colored lines. So the yellow line and the blue line, those are years where there was no World Cup in Germany. And the red line is where the World Cup was played in Germany, but it's the same sequence of dates, right? We're looking at May 1 through July 30th. And if you see the numbered dots up here, this is heart disease, so this is the number of heart disease events per day. You can see that the rate spikes up for the opening game, and every time the German national team plays, up till here. So number 7, what happened is in Game 6, Germany was eliminated, okay? So in Game 7, may be hard to see back there. Sorry. Game 7 here, Germany was just playing for, I forget what the lay expression is, but just basically for third place. The pat on the back, no one really cared. And then you can see Game 8, Germany wasn't playing, but that's the final, everybody cares about it. So obviously, World Cup soccer didn't cause the heart disease in these individuals, but they were individuals who had known or underlying disease. They got too excited, maybe they ate too much, they drank too much during the game, and they had a heart disease event very close to the game. So we did a series of studies, the first one back in 2003 using cases investigated by NIOSH, and then a larger study looking at an 11-year period of deaths collected by the U.S. Fire Administration with supplemented information from NIOSH. And so here's what we found. Well, if you look at the pattern of emergency calls throughout the day, here's quartiles of the day, so midnight to 6 a.m., 6 a.m. to noon, noon to 6 p.m., and 6 p.m. to midnight. You can see that in both studies, the proportion of heart disease deaths follows the proportion of emergency calls. That's EC, our emergency calls. So basically, the more emergencies you have, the more heart disease deaths you have, and the same was true for trauma deaths. I didn't show that in this slide. So that was our first indication that there really is a relationship between strenuous duties and heart disease events. In the lower half of the slide, you can see in the blue line, that's the normal circadian, or how heart disease events, strokes, heart attacks, et cetera, are distributed in the normal general population. We can see that, and many of you probably know this because you're EMTs or paramedics, the most frequent time for people to have a heart attack or stroke is between 6 a.m. and noon. And you can see that when firefighters are on the job, it's actually between noon and midnight because that's when they're most busy. Similarly, if we make estimations of how much annual time firefighters spend in different types of duty, in a series of 3 different studies, the 2 that I mentioned, plus another one revolving around heart disease retirements in Massachusetts, we look at odds ratios. This is something for you, those of you who are gamblers, you know about odds. So, the house is 20 times more likely to win, right? The same thing here. We're saying these numbers up at the top, they're saying that you're anywhere from 50 to 60 times more likely to have a heart disease event during fire suppression than you are during just resting in the firehouse or other non-emergency duties like inspection, cleaning a truck, just routine things around the station. Similarly, we can see that physical training, the risks are 5 to 7 times higher than non-emergency duty. And for alarm return and alarm response, we can see similar elevated rates, but clearly fire suppression being the most strikingly elevated. So this accounts, in the data set we looked at, for roughly 1/3 of all the heart disease deaths, even though it was estimated to account for really about 2% of firefighters' professional time. Now, I said it's an interaction, so it's also important, and these aren't at random. So we next needed to look at, why might 2 individuals walk away from a fire and another person not walk away? What makes certain people more likely to have a heart disease event? And it turns out it's the same factors that predict heart disease events in everybody else. In Joe Sixpack, Joe Citizen, Jane Citizen. It's the same risk factors in Joe or Jane firefighter. The first study that really put this on the map was done by a gentleman named Dr. Gluck and his colleagues in Cincinnati. And I think he really did the fire service a favor, because what he wasn't an occupational doctor. He didn't look at occupational risks in this particular study. But what he did is he said, let's screen everybody for heart disease in the Cincinnati Fire Department, and then let's follow them over time, and we'll compare them to the general population. Now, he had a small sample size relatively, so he didn't find any significant differences in terms of the rate of heart attacks that occurred over his study period. However, he was clearly able to show that he was able to predict the presence of coronary heart disease and future myocardial infarctions or heart attacks by the presence of well-known risk factors like age, smoking, blood pressure, body mass index, that is basically obesity, and lipids. So we're talking about blood cholesterol, either the good or the bad. In concert with the studies that we looked at firefighters' duties and other occupational factors, we also looked at underlying factors. And I'll just show you, this was one, 2003, another one of heart disease retirements in Massachusetts, and a study of case fatality looking at heart disease events that occurred on duty, comparing those that ended up being a fatal event with those that were non-fatal, where the individual went off to retirement. This was in American Journal of Cardiology. And I'll just talk about them all together, basically to save time here. So what you can see again here in the table, we're looking at odds ratios. So any number you see, basically that means, for example, if we look at the top left box, age greater than or equal to 45 years. So that means persons 45 years or older, like myself, 18 times more likely to have a heart disease event on duty than individuals less than 45 years of age. Smokers, you can see, obviously that's not a surprise. They're much more likely to have events than non-smokers. Individuals with hypertension, diabetes mellitus, elevated cholesterol, and then very important is, and I'll talk about each of these more, but a prior diagnosis of heart disease. So we can see that individuals who already, they know they have it, they've had that heart attack, they've had a stent, they've had a bypass, they are 30 to 35 times more likely than their colleagues to have a subsequent event, in particular a fatality. So let's talk a bit about the individual risk factors, because I think that's a little bit, that's important as well. Hypertension is a topic that's very important, and I know the IFF has been involved with this in the past with Novartis and others, trying to get individuals to be identified, to make sure that if you have high blood pressure, you're aware of it, because many individuals have high blood pressure and they don't know it. It really causes very few, if any, symptoms at all early on in its course. And if we look at individuals who, in this particular slide, we're looking at police and fire officers who went on to have a heart disease event or stroke. And if we compare their mean or average blood pressure, systolic and diastolic, compared to those who had no event, we can see that the differences are highly significant. However, a lot of you are EMTs, paramedics, so you're familiar with blood pressure numbers. Look at the mean values. We're talking about 140 to 146 systolic. That is a high blood pressure reading. We classify anything as 140 or above as hypertension, but it's certainly not anything that in an emergency situation you'd be excited about or writing home. However, the problem is if that's what your value is on your checkup, and the doctor says, well, just eat a little less salt, walk some more, do some more exercise, and next year you come back and it's the same thing and the same thing and the same thing and the same thing, you might be ending up in that event category as opposed to the no event category. Left ventricular hypertrophy, well, basically the number one causes of that is hypertension, 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 followed by obesity, obesity, obesity. And what we found is looking at the fatalities that NIOSH has investigated, that we have looked at very carefully in our studies, almost 60% of those individuals who had an autopsy where this was looked at, they ended up having left ventricular hypertrophy. Now, this is your heart. This is your heart on LVH. Which heart do you want? This heart can fill up with blood and it can pump it out. Obviously, it's going to be hard to fill that heart with blood. It's hard for that heart to pump it out, and it's hard for the coronary arteries, the blood vessels that supply the heart with blood and oxygen. That's a really big muscle. It's going to be really hard to get oxygen through that whole muscle, especially during a period of extreme stress and exertion. And so these individuals are more prone, even in the absence of coronary artery disease, they're more prone to a heart attack, to a sudden cardiac death by arrhythmia, et cetera. We need to learn more about this. We're planning to do some more studies on this, but just to give you an example, I mean, this is not just sort of a snapshot, but here are the fatality report from Rita Fahey at National Fire Protection Association. There were 4 cases in that report that were featured among the 35 cardiac deaths, and they were featured. They were all investigated by NIOSH, and you can see all 4 of them had very large hearts. Normally, the weight of the heart is about 450 grams. You can see all these individuals were well above that. And normally, the left ventricular wall should be no more than 1 centimeter, up to maybe 1.1 centimeter in athletes. So some individuals who do a lot of physical exertion, working out, especially aerobic types of activities, cross-country skiing, cycling, et cetera, they can have a slight healthy enlargement, but maybe to 1.1. But you see these individuals, 1.6, 1.5, one individual there, 3 centimeters. Probably that's something, what his heart looked like on autopsy. Smoking, no surprise, the odds for a smoker to have a heart disease fatality or a heart disease retirement, much higher than non-smokers. But to put it in really simple terms, probably about 10% of the profession still smokes, but about 40 to 50% of the heart disease events are occurring in smokers. So I know your union has done an excellent job on this, trying to not just promote smoking cessation, but going tobacco-free in general. But this is really something that is, it's just totally preventable. And it's hard for those individuals who are addicted to the nicotine, but there are ways to fight it. Here's an area where we, and I mean we collectively, physicians, fire departments, fire chiefs, the union, everybody I think has really fallen down and not done a good job on. This is a problem we're aware of. So every year NFPA does their studies, NIOSH does their studies, we've done our studies. 25 to 30%, maybe even a third of the deaths are occurring in individuals who had a prior known diagnosis of heart disease. In the 2010 report, I looked at it on my way traveling down here. At least 11 of the 35 cases had a known diagnosis. They also said for 10 or 12 cases, no information was available. So it's probably actually higher than that. So this really is a problem. It's always a tough decision to pull anybody out of a job that they want to do. If the person wants to go on to retirement, that's an easy decision for everybody to support. But when that individual wants to come back to work, that's a very tough decision. So the best recommendation I can make, the NFPA has come up with criteria that where it's safe or not safe, and in most cases it's really not safe. Obesity. Basically, the problem with obesity is that it leads to pooling and clustering of all of the risk factors that, with the exception of smoking, that underlie heart disease. So higher blood sugar, higher blood lipids, lower HDL, that's a good cholesterol, a higher blood pressure, sleep apnea, LVH, etc. So no surprise that when we look at individuals who are obese, they have a higher odds of a heart disease event. Now the bigger issue is really that, where are we going? And here really the fire service is a mirror of the general population in the United States. So as the general population in our country is getting fatter and fatter, so goes the fire service. And this is just a plot looking from the 1980s through 2005. And you can see that, these are different studies throughout North America. And the BMI, regardless of the age, is going up. So much so to the point that if we look at recruits in 2005, they are heavier or just as heavy as 40 to 46-year-old firefighters were 15 years before them. Now, I know someone's going to say, but doctor, body mass index, that's a terrible measure, especially in people like firefighters because we're really muscular. And it's true. If I look at NFL linebackers and fullbacks, and I look at certain firefighters, the BMI is going to be an overestimate. However, someone actually did the study. My colleague Carlos Poston and a group with Sarah Yankee, and they collected data on close to 700 volunteer and career firefighters throughout the Missouri Valley. This is, I think, like 10 or 12 states included in this region. And so although there are clearly individuals who are extremely fit, that's not true for the majority. So actually what they found is that BMI, when they compared BMI and body fat measured on a bioelectrical impedance scale. That's a scale you get on, some of you probably know, with bare feet. Usually it has hand grips as well. It's a small electric current, and it measures the body water, which is basically a correlate of your muscle mass. And so if we took a bodybuilder who had a very high BMI and we put him on a Tanita scale, that person would show a low body fat, even though they have a high BMI. But what we found on average is while the prevalence in career firefighters of obesity was about 1/3 by BMI, it was close to 50% by body fat. So that means there are a lot of people who, as known in the business, they're classified as skinny fat. That means that their BMI was less than 30, but their body fat was over 25% for a male. So it is important to know your numbers. So BMI could be an overestimate for certain individuals, but if you have any doubt, get a body fat, check it out, and then go with the objective numbers. What about the risk with age? This is, I said it's a chronic disease, and we can see the very earliest signs of this in teenagers with fatty streaks in their aorta. So obviously, as you get older and older, we all have to eat food, and generally the cholesterol that gets deposited doesn't go away. If you go on extreme diets and you do extreme amounts of exercise, you can sometimes regress that. But in general, what we're doing is we're slowing the progression. And as you get older, you're more and more likely to have heart disease. And so it's important for two reasons. One is, so this is, increasing age groups. Regardless of the type of duty, the risk of death is higher and higher. And one of the important take-home points, who are the individuals that we always do medical examinations and physical abilities tests on? The 20 to 39-year-olds, right, who are entering the job. They're the ones who are, and they have to be tested just like everybody else, but they're actually at the lowest risk. And then the individuals who are at higher risk, in many jurisdictions, they're not having annual medical examinations. They're never having a physical abilities test again. So, and if we look at the fatality data, this is more a problem of the volunteer service than the career service, but there are a large number of the deaths. In 2010, it was almost 1/3 of the deaths were in volunteer firefighters over the age of 60. And many of those people were really not, if you look at the reports, they're often not involved in a strenuous duty. They were directing traffic, they were doing something else, but they're at that age where it's more likely. What can you do about it in terms of protecting yourself, in terms of fitness? Well, the NFPA and others, based upon studies of simulated firefighting, they've come up with an estimate that it requires roughly 12 metabolic equivalents. Those are the units that we use when we measure somebody on a stress test, that is the aerobic capacity or the work capacity that's required to safely perform the essential duties of firefighting. And we know in the general population that the more fit you are, the lower your heart disease risk. We could look here. If we look at all studies, the more active you are, that is, you report to me, doctor, I exercise 3 times a week, 5 times a week. That's your self-report. And how many minutes, et cetera. So when you get to the highest percentiles of self-reported physical activity, you're about 30% lower risk. But if we actually measure your fitness on a treadmill, collections and high blood pressure. It's almost anywhere from 50 to 70% in individuals, regardless of their age, in the lowest fitness group, and that rate is only 0 to 10% among the fittest individuals, regardless of age. In fact, in this study, we showed using statistical methods that although age was a predictor of the metabolic syndrome, fitness was much, when we ran the data using metabolic syndrome and adjusting it for age, metabolic syndrome, for every additional MET you got, you were 30% less likely to develop metabolic syndrome. If we ran the data for age was, and we controlled for metabolic syndrome, age was no longer significant. So, you know, you can't change your age, but you can become more fit. Similarly, if we look at the odds of having an abnormal stress exercise test based upon the fitness level, you can see that in the lowest fitness group, the odds for different abnormalities are 5 to up to 15, 17 times higher than they are in the lowest fitness group. We're going to be following these individuals now over time to see if we can confirm that not only is this predictive of an abnormal test in the laboratory, but this is going to be predictive of heart disease events, retirements, injuries, and other phenomenon like that on the job. So in concluding, take-home messages: strenuous duties can precipitate or trigger cardiovascular events. We can generally predict individuals, at least in a statistical way. They have known heart disease, a prior diagnosis, or an excess of risk factors. Many of these individuals could be identified, therefore, we could have prevented the event either by modifying that person's activities and treating their risk factors very aggressively beforehand, or in the worst case scenario, restricting them from strenuous duties. Known diagnosis of heart disease and emergency duties generally do not mix well. Smoking, we've talked about. Aggressively treating hypertension, other risk factors. We probably need to start moving towards standards on obesity and exercise. Regular medical exams, the kind of things that are in the Wellness Fitness Initiative. We do need improved tests to identify left ventricular hypertrophy and enlarged heart, because this is something that we don't want to just find out about it at the autopsy table. We want to know about it when the person comes from their annual exam and see if we can do something about it beforehand. And there are a number of other interesting studies going on throughout the country, you know, looking at the importance of sleep, flu shots, aspirin, drugs like Lipitor. I think in future years we'll have more to report to you on that. But we think, again, that this is the model, and we can probably using the ETT, or exercise tolerance test, and measuring people's CRF, or cardiorespiratory fitness, we can identify individuals here who need very aggressive risk reduction, and we can also identify those individuals who are really sort of at the cusp of the trigger before the trigger hits them. We put all this information into one paper that just came out July, August, and I can email this to anybody who wants it as a PDF. Be happy to do that. And I'm probably running out of time. I just thank you again for the honor of being here, and your organization for all the support, and many other individuals who have helped us in this type of research. So I'll turn it back to Dr. McDermott. Thank you.
So we have time for some questions. If anybody has a question, you want to come up to the microphone, say your name and what local you're from. This is your chance, Brain Trust up here. Come on to the microphone, please. Introduce yourself and what local you're from, please.
Hi, my name's John Sierra. I'm with Local 786 in Stamford, Connecticut. My question was, would I be wrong to believe that 10 individuals exposed to the same carcinogen might develop different forms of cancer?
So the question had to do with 10 individuals exposed to the same carcinogen might develop different forms of cancer. It's very possible that 10 individuals exposed to the same thing, some people won't develop any cancer. It's very confusing. We didn't get into some of the details here, but one of the things that IARC, the group in France, does and other researchers do is we actually try to map a cancer to a specific organ system that we try to map the exposure to a specific organ system. So you are correct if your question is, does the same cancer-causing agent cause cancer in different organs? That is hypothetically possible, but it's also possible that we're more likely to see a cancer excess, in other words, too much, in specific organs. So some cancer-causing agents cause cancer, I wouldn't say across the board, but can cause it in more than one organ system. But there are also some that what's difficult is the same people exposed exactly the same might have a different outcome, if that's also your question. It's kind of not fair. Yep. More questions?
Morning, Rowan Taylor, Metro Dade, Local 1403. Something interesting you said about the studies for the 35 deaths last year. We're in a battle right now with our state in Florida. They have a belief that firefighters can work till they're 65, almost 70 years old with our legislators. You mentioned that there was a direct link to age in those deaths last year. I know you showed 5 of them were the age of 50, and you said something about 60 years old in the 35 deaths. Can you go over that again?
Sure. So question was regarding older firefighters and how, you know, it seems, can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Yeah. All right, thanks. Question was regarding older firefighters and the risk. Clearly, as you get into the 50s, the risk is higher. But as you get in, once you pass the age of 60, the risk goes dramatically up. We don't know so much about that. We know most about that from volunteer firefighters because there just don't happen to be that many career firefighters over the age of 60. You know, in the studies, et cetera, the data we're collecting now, we have, I don't know, I think data over 1,200 firefighters, but we have very few, only a handful of individuals over the age of 60 in the career departments we're looking at. But clearly the data bears out that you know, when you adjust for all other factors, the risk is extremely high in those individuals over 60. That's not to say that there is no one who can safely do it over the age of 60, because there are individuals who have maintained themselves in very, very high levels of fitness. But it really comes down to probably more careful screening and fitness standards. But I would think it would be quite challenging for a legislator to justify a firefighter working past the age of 65 in terms of, you know, doing all the full duties, including attending all types of emergencies.
Jonah Smith with the Charlotte, North Carolina, Local 660. There's some studies that have come out and on the fire service level about hydrogen cyanide and some of the effects that it, you know, presents both acute and chronic. Is there any plans to, or are there any plans to do any sort of studies on that? Because, you know, some of the cardiovascular risk factors go through the roof when you talk about the HCN exposures on the fire ground. Like I said, both acute and a chronic effect, especially when combined with CO. Are there any plans out there to do any studies on that?
Yeah, the question is regarding hydrogen cyanide. We're not looking at that in our particular study because we're relying on medical data that's collected at the annual examinations through exams like the Wellness Fitness Initiative. I don't know of anyone who is looking at that. I think NIOSH may have looked at that in some specific fire departments where there were incidents. You know, just as a general point, it is very difficult in any one case, even when it's occurring on the fire ground, to attribute it to one factor. it appears to be an interaction of psychological stress, physical stress, particulate air pollution, toxic smokes and gases, so we're talking about things like hydrogen cyanide, carbon monoxide, et cetera. But you also need to remember that even if 30% of the deaths occur during fire suppression, another 70% are not occurring in fire suppression. So there it's very hard to invoke hydrogen cyanide as an explanation. So I think it's something that should be looked at, but we're currently focused on other areas.
Dan Hilton, Vancouver, British Columbia. My question relates to general preventative measures around exposures. I mean, the obvious is around respiratory protection, which is fairly easy, but for dermal protection, can you comment on, how you feel the protective measures are with the vapor barriers and turnout gear, also exposures related to dirty turnout gear and, cleaning turnout gear, and just, that type of exposure protection, just, because we've talked about the disease, but, maybe some comments about preventative measures.
I can say just a couple of things about the dermal exposure. NIOSH, and I'll get your card, Tom Hales and their, our HETAB group is a branch in our division, has been working with the Chicago Fire Department on trying to measure dermal exposure through the turnout gear. And there have been a series of simulated fires that they've conducted measurements on at the Fire Academy there in Chicago. And I'll be glad to take your information and get the researcher in touch with you about what they're finding as far as that's concerned. That would be of help.
Steve Pignatello, local 1568 in Rico, Virginia. My question is, you brought up LVH, and I don't want to massacre the actual words that you said. We currently are fighting a 2-year battle under our presumptive law in a case involving that, and we lost it because they said that wasn't related. So I was wondering if that evidence is out there, that documentation or study that links the hypertension in our job, specifically to LVH, is available that we can try and use to appeal our case.
So your question is there evidence that LVH is caused by firefighting per se?
Yes. Or the factors that you talked about, hypertension, which leads to it, which that's covered under our presumptive law currently, but
Yeah.
But is there some document somewhere that I can access to use in our
Right.
case?
We did publish last year a paper in, or 2009, the American Journal of Hypertension, reviewing hypertension and blood pressure phenomena in firefighters, police officers, and emergency medical responders. There are reasons, having to do with shift work, stressors, and other things, noise, that theoretically could increase firefighters' blood pressure. But at this point in time, there's no linkage that I'm aware of or any specific data that proves that firefighters have a higher prevalence of hypertension than individuals in the general population. The data that's out there says that, on average, the systolic and diastolic pressure and the proportion of persons with pre-hypertension and hypertension is about the same as it is in the general population. Where the data is very strong is that if we look at persons succumbing to fatalities on the fire ground, those individuals are extremely prone, almost 60% of them when an autopsy is done. They end up having that finding of left ventricular hypertrophy. There are certain states that recognize hypertension as part of presumption, and in other states it's not, but those seem to be more political decisions than based on epidemiology.
That is true. Oh, thank you.
Yeah, I'll be happy to email you the paper on, if you want to get my card, or I can email you the hypertension paper.
Great.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, I'm Allison, local 3558 from Ohio. This is for Dr. Scales. all the study you've done on heart disease and heart attacks, have you found anything with atrial fib uncontrolled? Any research on that? It just seems within the last year or so, just at one station, 3 guys having to be cardioverted or having issues with atrial fib. Have you seen any research on that? More prevalent in firefighters or work conditions?
But question regards atrial fibrillation, which is a type of a heart arrhythmia involving the chambers of the heart that push the blood down to the ventricle. And it's a common problem as people get older, and it can be provoked by things like valvular heart disease, hypertension, sleep apnea, pulmonary disease, and certain medications. We haven't conducted any studies of that in particular, and I'm not aware of any that have been done in firefighters, but because it has a number of different underlying causes, it would be important to look at those 3 individuals and determine whether or not they have the same reasons for having atrial fibrillation or they have different reasons for having atrial fibrillation. If there was a common reason for the atrial fibrillation, then maybe there's something that could be traced back to their job.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Tim Duncan, Clinton Township, Michigan. You were saying earlier about the LVH, a little bit more definitive tests to determine whether you have a problem with that. Our last round of physicals a couple years ago at our department, we had probably about 10 guys out of 80 that were showing initial signs of it. None of them turned out to have it. Would you say that we should be pushing for like echocardiograms as part of our prevention, or for that type, or is that a little too extreme to start with?
Yeah. So question is about LVH detection, and unfortunately the methods are not that great. Sometimes we can see the earliest signs based upon the electrocardiogram. There are certain caveats with that. So in very young individuals, it's basically based on high voltage in certain leads of the EKG, and that may not be valid in very young people. And right now, you know, the routine test and the test that would be done to follow up would be the echocardiogram. And we would recommend that in individuals who have signs of chronic uncontrolled high blood pressure, or even chronically elevated stage 1. So people, you know, their blood pressure has never reached stage 2, like over 160, over 100, but they've been chronically over 140, over 90. The issue with echo is that based upon an individual's body size, so someone like yourself or myself, echo would be a very good test. In a very large individual, the distance between the skin and the heart, where the sensor is for the ultrasound probe, is greater, and sometimes the ultrasound is not as sensitive or as good as picking things up. So we have some ideas about putting a study together to look at that, but at this time we would recommend, if individuals have high blood pressure or they have signs of LVH on an EKG, then they should get that checked out by an echo.
And would you say there's one particular stress test that's better than another? At one point we did treadmill, the other point we were doing like on a bike. Is there
There are protocols both for bicycles and treadmills. Most people use treadmills. I think it's easier for most individuals to reach a maximum heart rate and a maximum workload on running on the treadmill than it is on the bike. It's easier to get leg fatigue, I think, on the bike. And I think that the Bruce protocol, which is on the treadmill, is, you know, that's the most widely used and the most standardized. And that's what the clinics that are in our study, that's what they're using. But I think if the question is about a submaximal versus a maximal test, a maximal test is much better, because when you're actually out there attending to an emergency, the studies show that oftentimes people will be at maximum heart rates or even exceeding maximum heart rates. So there's really no sense in testing somebody at a submaximal level, because it's not going to show you know, what happens at a maximal level. And you'd rather see what happens at a maximal level under a controlled situation in the clinic than, you know, waiting till that happens out on the fire ground.
Right, thanks.
Hey, I'm Jeff Bickler from Orlando. I actually am an attorney. I represent firefighters with presumptive claims. And I was interested if you've done any research on the cumulative effect of fire service as opposed to, you know, these scenes on a fire ground where you've obviously got maximum effort and all those types of things, because I think that may be just as important for us as advocates. In Florida right now, we're having a bit of a war over the continuing existence of the presumption. So I think this is something we're going to, and we probably need some expert advice when we have that legislative fight. But I was interested if you could answer that.
Sure. So the question was regarding, you know, firefighting as a cause of chronic progression or contributor to heart disease. And like I said, there are a lot of reasons to suspect a role, certain duties and exposures that firefighters have. We haven't personally done any of those studies, but a large number of them, and I mentioned them in the slides earlier, they were done in the 1980s and 1990s. And they looked at, you know, just like prior studies were done of cancer. And they struggled with what Dr. McDermott was talking about. You know, do we use police officers as a control group? Do we use general population as a control group? And, you know, how do you conduct that? And how do you control for other factors like smoking and obesity and other things? They're basically crude mortality studies, and they have to do with, you know, just counts of people who died due to heart disease in one population compared to another, and they really weren't positive, largely, we think, because of the healthy worker effect. I don't know if there are any efforts underway to, you know, do that now where more data has been collected in departments and you have more of the contributing and confounding factors, lifestyle factors recorded, such as from the minimum data set and other things. I think you'd still have the same questions about who is the appropriate control group.
Well, I just want to thank our speakers and thank you all for your attention. And if you have any other questions and we're too shy to come to the microphone, you can come on up here. Thanks all.